The golden hall of the capital city shined as the tall windows poured light over the marble floor. People stood in silence while waiting for their queen. The banners of the empire hung high, showing the mark of unity and strength. Yet behind the great doors, Queen Alara stood still, her hands shaking, her legs weak. She whispered to herself, asking why her body betrayed her in moments when she needed to appear strong. She wanted to walk with calm steps, but her knees trembled and she felt the floor unsteady beneath her feet. The guards opened the doors, and the sound of the heavy wood echoed through the hall. All eyes turned toward her. She moved forward slowly, trying to hide the weakness in her legs with the long gown she wore. Each step felt heavy, and she feared someone would notice how her body shook. The lords and commanders bowed their heads, but she saw doubt in their eyes. To them, a queen had to show power without flaw. She feared they would not follow her if they knew her truth. She walked toward the throne, her heart beating fast. She sat down, her hands resting on the arms of the seat, her face calm, though her body still trembled. A silence filled the hall. Then one of the lords spoke of the dangers rising at the borders. Another spoke of unrest among the villages. They all waited for her answer. She gave her words steady, reminding them of loyalty and duty, though inside she fought to control her shaking legs. Later, when the court ended, Alara returned to her chamber. She closed the doors and leaned against them, breathing hard. Alone, she no longer had to hide her trembling. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw both strength and fear in her own face. She thought of her father, who once told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward despite it. She repeated those words quietly, hoping to believe them. Daniel, her trusted advisor, entered the chamber. He was a man of calm eyes and steady voice. He looked at her with concern, for he saw her struggle though others did not. He told her that the body can shake, but the heart must remain strong. He reminded her that her people did not need a queen without fear. They needed a queen who would fight for them even while afraid. His words gave her comfort, though her legs still trembled.
At night,
Alara sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. She saw the streets filled with people who worked, traded, and sang. They believed in the throne, they believed in her, though they knew little of her weakness. She wondered how long she could keep it hidden. She feared the day would come when her trembling legs would be seen by all, and the empire would doubt her power. Yet she also felt a fire in her heart. She wanted to prove that even if her body shook, her will would not. The next morning, she stood before her guards again. They looked at her with pride, ready to follow her commands. She forced her steps to be steady, though the tremble did not leave her. Each movement was a battle within herself. She smiled faintly, showing no fear in her eyes. The men around her thought she was strong, but only Daniel knew the truth. Whispers began to spread among the lords that the queen was fragile, that she could not stand without trembling. Some said it was only rumor, others feared it was true. Alara heard these whispers in the hallways. They cut her heart, but she held her head high. She knew that a queen could not fight whispers with denial, only with deeds. She promised herself she would show them in time that weakness could also carry strength. As the day closed, she walked once more into the empty throne room. She placed her hand on the throne, her body still shaking, and she spoke to herself. She said she would not run from her fear. She said she would not let trembling legs stop her from standing for her people. And though her voice was quiet, it carried the weight of a vow that would soon change the empire forever. The Council of Lords gathered in a quiet chamber far from the throne room. The walls were covered in tapestries, and candles burned low as the men spoke in hushed voices. At the center of the table sat Lord Carter, a man known for his sharp tongue and restless ambition. He leaned forward, his eyes cold as he spoke of the queen's trembling legs. He said the throne was too heavy for someone who could barely stand. The others listened carefully, some agreeing, others staying silent. None of them dared to speak their doubts in public, but in that secret chamber, the seeds of rebellion were being planted. Word began to spread through the corridors of the palace. Servants whispered that the queen was weak, that she could not walk without shaking. Soldiers heard the rumors and wondered if it was true. A few laughed in secret, saying they wanted a queen who could lead them without fear. But there were also many who felt pity, and some who grew even more loyal, believing she was human like them and carried her fears openly even if she did not show them. Queen Alara heard pieces of these whispers as she passed through the halls. She did not stop to correct them. She only walked on, holding her head high, though her body trembled inside her gown. She knew the strength of a queen was not in words, but in actions, and she promised herself she would prove them wrong when the time came. That evening, she sat once again with Daniel in her chamber. The candles flickered, and her face was pale with worry. She asked him if the people would turn against her. Daniel told her that the people did not follow perfection, they followed courage. He said that her shaking was not her downfall unless she allowed it to be. She listened, though her heart still carried doubt. Meanwhile, Lord Carter and his allies sent messages to villages beyond the capital. They promised freedom from a trembling queen, speaking of strength and new order. Small groups of men began to gather, and the first whispers of rebellion grew louder. The capital itself did not yet know the danger, but it was coming closer with every passing day. Lara walked through the streets of her city to see her people. She wore a cloak to hide her crown and moved among merchants and farmers. She watched them work with tired hands and honest smiles. She saw children playing in the dust, running freely with laughter. For a moment, she forgot her trembling legs, for she saw a life stronger than fear. She thought of how much she wanted to protect them, even if her body failed her. When she returned to the palace, General Nathan awaited her. He was tall, with eyes that carried years of battle. He told her of strange movements near the borders of men gathering under secret banners. She asked if the soldiers still trusted her. Nathan bowed and said the army would not abandon their queen. Yet he also told her that courage must be shown, for men follow what they see. That night she could not sleep. She walked alone into the throne room and touched the cold arms of the seat. Her legs shook more than ever, and she sank onto the throne with heavy breath. She whispered that she was not afraid of dying, only of failing. The hall was empty, but her words felt like a promise to herself. Days later, Carter's voice grew louder in the city. He told many that the queen could not stand without trembling, that the throne needed a stronger ruler. Some believed him, others called him a liar. The city began to divide. The palace walls echoed with both loyalty and doubt. Lara faced her lords in the council once more. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the table. She spoke clearly, her voice steady even though her legs were not. She told them that strength was not the absence of fear, but the will to face it. Some looked away, but Daniel and Nathan nodded with quiet pride. They knew she would not give in, not even to her own weakness. As the council ended, she returned to her chamber and stood by the window. The city stretched out before her, calm on the surface, but restless beneath. She felt the storm building, both within her heart and beyond the palace walls, though she knew the time was near when words would not be enough. She would have to stand before her people, trembling or not, and lead them into the fire that was coming. The sun rose over the capital with a red glow that seemed to warn of what was coming. Queen Alara stood on the balcony of her chamber, watching the city wake. Merchants opened their stalls, soldiers marched through the streets, and children played as if the world would never change. Yet deep inside, she knew the city was standing on the edge of a storm. The whispers of rebellion were no longer only whispers. They were voices gathering strength. General Nathan entered with a serious face. He carried a message from scouts who had returned during the night. It reported that an army was moving toward the capital, men led by Lord Carter and other lords who no longer bowed to the crown. Alara held the letter with trembling hands, reading each word slowly. Her heart pounded, and her legs felt weak. She knew the time had come to face the truth. She told Nathan to gather the council and the commanders. The great hall was soon filled with men in armor, their faces lined with worry. Alara walked among them, her gown brushing against the marble floor. She stood before them, her voice calm, though her knees shook beneath her. She told them of the rebellion marching against the city. She said the throne would not fall, not while she had breath to defend it. Some soldiers shouted their loyalty, while others exchanged doubtful looks. But Nathan's steady voice rose above all, declaring that the queen would lead them. Later, in the privacy of her chamber, Alara sat with Daniel. He looked at her trembling hands and asked if she was afraid. She admitted she was, more than ever. But she said fear was not her enemy. Fear would remind her what was at stake. Daniel told her the people would see her heart, if not her body. He urged her to ride with her army when the time came, for nothing would inspire them more than a queen who fought at their side. When word spread that Alara herself would march with the soldiers, the city buzzed with voices. Some thought it was madness, others felt hope return. Farmers and merchants began to bring supplies to the palace gates. Women wove banners of gold and white, while blacksmiths worked day and night to sharpen swords. The city that had once doubted her now prepared to stand behind her. On the morning of departure, Alara dressed in golden armor made for her father years ago. It was heavy, and her legs trembled as she stood in it, but she refused to let anyone see her fall. She walked slowly through the courtyard, where her army waited. Thousands of men held their weapons high, watching their queen. She mounted her horse with care, her heart racing as she lifted her banner. Her voice carried over the crowd, steady and clear, promising that they would not fall to traitors. The soldiers cheered, and for a moment, she forgot her weakness. She saw in their eyes not pity but faith. Daniel rode at her side, and Nathan took command of the lines. Together they marched through the city gates, banners waving, armor shining under the rising sun. The people lined the streets, shouting the queen's name as she passed. Children ran behind the soldiers, singing songs of courage. The city that had once doubted now believed, at least for this moment. That night, the army camped on the plains beyond the capital. Fires burned across the field, and men sang songs to keep their fear away. Alara walked among them, speaking with the common soldiers. She touched their shoulders, listened to their worries, and told them she trembled as well, but still stood with them. The men looked at her with wide eyes, realizing their queen was human like them. Her honesty brought them comfort, and they swore to fight harder. As the stars filled the sky, Nathan came to her tent. He told her that Carter's forces were only a day away. The battle would come with the dawn. Alara sat in silence, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She prayed the soldiers would not see her fear, yet inside her a fire burned brighter than ever. She told Nathan she would ride at the front of the army when the battle began. Nathan bowed deeply, saying the soldiers would follow her into any storm. Alara lay awake that night, listening to the sound of her army resting. She thought of her father's words, of Daniel's faith, of Nathan's loyalty, and of her people waiting behind the walls of the capital. Body trembled without end, but her spirit stood tall. She whispered into the dark that even if her legs could not carry her, her heart would carry the empire. The dawn was close, and with it, the trial of a trembling queen. The morning sky was heavy with gray clouds as the army of Queen Alara formed on the wide plain. The sound of armor, horses, and banners moving in the wind filled the air.
Across the field
stood the forces of Lord Carter, their numbers vast, their lines stretching far. The traitor himself rode in front, his dark cloak trailing behind him as he raised his sword high. His men shouted with pride, believing the capital would fall before sunset. Alara sat upon her horse at the front of her own army. Her golden armor shined, though her body trembled beneath it. She could feel the shaking in her legs, the weakness that she could never escape. She feared her men would notice, yet when she lifted her banner and looked into their faces, she saw nothing but loyalty. Her voice carried over the field as she shouted that they fought not for her throne, but for their homes, their families, and their freedom. The soldiers roared in reply, their cries rising like thunder. The horns blew, and the battle began. Carter's forces surged forward with shields raised and swords flashing. The earth shook under the weight of thousands of boots. Alara gripped her reins tightly, her heart pounding. She urged her horse forward, riding at the head of her soldiers. Fear burned through her body, but her spirit refused to bend. The clash of steel rang out as the two armies met. Alara swung her sword with trembling hands. Each strike was heavy, yet she did not stop. Her men saw their queen fighting beside them, and it filled them with courage. They shouted her name as they pushed against the enemy. Though her legs shook, her presence was steady, and the sight of her golden banner lifted high made her soldiers stronger. Lord Carter rode through the chaos, his eyes searching for her. When he saw her at the front lines, his face twisted with anger. He forced his horse toward her, cutting down anyone in his way. At last he reached her, raising his blade and shouting that a trembling queen could never hold a throne. Their swords clashed, sparks flying in the air. The fight between them drew the eyes of both armies. Soldiers paused in their struggle to watch queen and traitor face each other. Carter struck hard, his strength pushing her back. Her legs nearly gave out, but she held firm. She thought of her father's words, of Daniel's faith, of Nathan's loyalty, and of the people waiting for her victory. Her body trembled, but her heart was steady. She raised her sword once more and struck with all her will. Her blade cut through Carter's guard and sent him falling from his horse. The field went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted with cries. Her soldiers roared with triumph, while Carter's men began to falter. The sight of their fallen leader broke their spirit. Many threw down their weapons, while others turned and ran. Alara sat on her horse, her chest heaving, her sword still in her hand. She trembled more than ever, her body weak and shaking, but she did not let it show. She lifted her banner high, shouting for her men to press forward. With renewed strength, they drove the enemy back until the field belonged to them alone. The battle ended with the plain covered in dust, broken shields, and the cries of the wounded. Alara dismounted slowly, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. Nathan rushed to her side, but she lifted her hand to stop him. She wanted her soldiers to see her still standing. She wanted them to know that even in weakness, she did not fall. The men gathered around her, shouting her name again and again. They knelt before her, not as subjects to a ruler of birth, but as loyal hearts to a leader who had stood with them in the fire. Alara looked at them with tears in her eyes. She whispered to herself that fear had not broken her, and trembling had not stopped her. She had faced the storm and held her crown. That night the campfires burned bright across the field. The soldiers sang of the trembling queen who had stood tall in battle. Alara sat quietly by the fire with Daniel and Nathan at her side. Her body was still shaking, but inside she felt stronger than she ever had. The war was not over, but this day had shown that her spirit was greater than her fear. The battlefield lay quiet the next morning. The fires had gone out, and smoke drifted over the plains. Now soldiers moved slowly, gathering the wounded and carrying the fallen. Queen Alara walked among them, her golden armor marked with dust and scratches. Her legs trembled so much that every step felt like it might be her last, but she refused to let anyone carry her. She wanted her men to see her still moving, still standing. The soldiers bowed as she passed, their faces filled with respect. They whispered that their queen had fought beside them, that she had faced the traitor and won. Many of them had seen her shaking in battle, but none mocked her for it. Instead, they told each other that her trembling was proof she was human like them, yet she had still chosen to fight. To them, that was greater than any show of flawless strength. When the army returned to the capital, the city gates opened wide. The people poured into the streets, cheering and crying with joy. Flowers were thrown before the horses as the soldiers marched through. Alara rode slowly at the front, her banner high, her face calm, though her body quivered beneath the armor. Children shouted her name, and old men bowed deeply as she passed. The people no longer doubted her. They believed in her more than ever. In the great hall, she stood once again before her lords. This time there was no whisper of weakness in the air. Every eye was on her, waiting for her words. She looked around the hall, her hands shaking as she gripped the arms of the throne. She spoke simply, telling them the truth. She said her legs trembled and her body betrayed her every day. She admitted she was often afraid, even when she wore the crown. The hall was silent, her words heavy in the air. Then she said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to stand and move forward despite it. She told them that she would never hide her trembling again. Her people deserved honesty, and they deserved a queen who showed them that weakness could live beside strength. Daniel and Nathan stood at her side, their faces filled with pride. The lords bowed their heads, not in shame, but in respect. They knew her crown no longer rested only on birthright, but on the loyalty of an empire that had seen her heart. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Villages that had burned were given new supplies. Families who had lost fathers and sons were cared for by the throne. Alara visited them herself, walking with unsteady steps through ruined homes, promising to help them rise again. Her people saw her trembling legs and did not see weakness. They saw a queen who carried their burdens even as she carried her own. Songs began to spread across the land, sung by travelers and farmers alike. They called her the Trembling Queen, not as an insult, but as a name of honor. Children repeated the words with pride, and soldiers told the tale to keep courage in their hearts. Her story became more than her own, became a lesson that even fear could not stop a leader who truly loved her people. Years later, when her hair turned silver and her steps grew slower, she still walked the halls of her palace. She still trembled, but she no longer tried to hide it. Visitors from distant lands came to see her, curious about the queen whose body shook, but whose spirit had never bent. They left with respect, telling others that strength was not only in the sword or the crown, but in the will to rise when one's body wanted to fall.
Ow.
Daniel, older now, stood beside her, and Nathan's son served as her guard. She whispered the same words she had spoken long ago. She said her legs still trembled, that she could barely stand, but she had never allowed it to stop her. She closed her eyes with peace, knowing her story would live on. History remembered her not as a queen of steel or fire, but as a queen of trembling courage. Her name was carried in songs and stories for generations. And though her legs had never stopped shaking, her spirit had stood taller than any tower in her land.